You've already made your perfect draft. You've submitted it, you got it graded, you got it back. You're going to use it as your reference, or you can use one of my examples as your reference. Now, this was our ideal measurements, but the real world piece of wood might not be exactly half an inch this direction, and it might not be exactly 1.5 inches this direction. We're going to work with that, and I'm going to show you a couple techniques. The first thing that we need to do, you're going to take this piece of stock. This is called stock, because everybody gets the same size piece of wood, same dimensions. The total length of this 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch piece of stock is going to be 12¼ inches. Now, why 12¼ Because there's something called a kerf. When we cut this, the saw blade has a certain thickness to it. If you were to cut this with the scroll saw, the blade is a little bit thinner. But if you cut this on a miter saw, the blade is thicker. So I just gave you some room for sawdust, because every time the blade, any type of blade, is going to go and engage the wood, and it's going to start sawing on the wood, of course you're going to get sawdust. Well, that sawdust, it comes from somewhere. It comes from the wood, right? So if you were to just cut, a little bit off the end, that would go away. So that would change your overall length. So if you cut in the middle, you have to realize that instead of having 12¼ inches, you're going to have 12¼ overall inches minus whatever the thickness of that blade was, because it's turned into sawdust. Important thing for you to realize. So I'm going to show you 2 examples now of how to cut this. At the end, the result needs to be that we have 3 pieces that are the equal length. Do they have to be exactly 4 inches? No, they don't have to be exactly 4 inches. Don't obsess about that, but do make sure that they are very, very close to exactly the same length, okay? The puzzle will still work. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to take you over to the scroll saw, and then I'm going to take you over to the miter saw, and we'll demonstrate proper cut. Okay, we're going to have a quick refresher on the scroll saw here too, but first I want to show you the combination square. This combination square has a brass nut right here. If you loosen it just slightly, you'll be able to slide the fence to the exact measurement you need. In this case, just slide that fence up to 4 inches and tighten it down. Now, you can take your wood, press that up against the fence, and you'll see the scale of inches laid across your stock. You can take your pencil and mark like this, the very end of the ruler. So that first line is 1/16. 0 is way back here. It's like the edge of the ruler back here, okay? So now you've got a line that's 4 inches from the end, and then you can turn your combination square this direction, and I'm not measuring anything. I'm just using this as a perpendicular straight edge to go ahead and mark a line like this. Now, as we were talking about a moment ago, the blade has a kerf, a thickness to it, and that wood is going to turn into sawdust. So you want to make sure that you take this blade, it'll cut like this, right? You want to make sure that you're cutting on the waste side. So what I like to do is put an X on the waste side just to remind myself that that's the side I want the blade to be on. If the blade cuts right on that line, then you're taking away from the measurement you just made, right? From here to that line is 4 inches. So I need to be able to just barely see that line at the end of the cut. At this point, you've been over the safety tests on the scroll saw, but you need to remember how to put your blade in. So we have here the pressure foot. We'll let that not be all the way at the top because it'll get in the way, so just let it float in the middle and then tighten it. It doesn't take much to tighten it. Please don't over tighten it. Remove the table insert. Take your scroll saw blade. The teeth need to face downward. Now, inside here, there's a little forked piece of metal. You want the pins of the bottom of your blade to hook in there. So hook that in and then put some upward pressure on the blade and position your hand underneath the pressure foot. So we're gonna press down on the top part of this mechanism. We're gonna slip the pins in up here at the top. And now there's a little bit of tension on the mechanism. To tighten it down, we're gonna press down on this back lever, the tension adjustment lever. And you shouldn't ever turn it left and right like that. It should be set where it's set, and you leave it alone. The only thing that you can do is lift it up and back down. You do need to make sure you press it down though. If you don't, then your blade won't actually be in there. And this is what it sounds like when your blade is tightened down. If your blade is not tightened down, well, that's what happens. You don't want that to happen. Just gotta make sure that you tighten that guy down, okay? Then you need to put your table insert back. That's very important. Just like this. I do have my safety glasses on. Please put your safety glasses on. Make sure that your speed adjustment, do not max it out, do not minimum it out, just put it right in the middle, okay? Middle is the best. Now the problem with a scroll saw is that the blade will turn on you, but that's actually the good thing too, because this machine is meant to cut turns and curves. What we want to do is lower the pressure foot onto the piece of wood, just let it rest on the piece of wood, don't push it down or anything, and then tighten it, and it's going to press down into the wood as you tighten it. So now you can see it won't come up when the blade goes. So we're going to turn it on, and I'm going to gently press it through, remembering to keep my blade on the waist side of my line. Here we go. So when you cut, you might feel like you have to slightly turn that thing to keep it going straight, and do that. You can't just push it through in what feels like is straight, because as I said, that blade flexes on you. So you have to keep a sharp eye along that line. And as you can see here, guys, it's definitely possible to cut a straight line with a scroll saw, especially for this project. That's not impossible. You just have to keep your eye on your work, okay? Now I'm going to show you how to do this in a different way on the miter saw. Okay, here we are over at the miter saw. We'll go over a few safe use steps here in a second, but first we got to mark our next piece of wood. So I have here the other measuring tool that you might use. This is called a speed square. So it's square here, right, and it looks like a triangle. You can take it wherever you need to go, and you can mark your distance. It also helps you mark different roof truss angles over here, but we're only interested in this scale right here, your inch scale. So if you take your piece of stock and you shove it up against the fence, you'll see, you know, your measurement over here. We're trying to measure the length, right? So we'll put a flat edge up against there, and you can see right about 4 inches. It's maybe a little bit longer. We can fine tune that with a sander later. And you can put your piece of wood behind the scale. Make sure your wood is flat up against that fence back there, tight. And then with your writing hand, you can come over here to the mark and put a small mark on the piece of wood. Same thing that we did before, you can take your piece of wood the other direction and then mark across here for a straight line. Okay, this will be the waist side, because remember I measured from here over. Okay, so this blade on the miter saw has a bigger kerf, so it's going to take away more extra wood. So that's okay. We just need to make sure that we have that wood to spare. Now to get yourself a safe cut on the miter saw, first of all, this is in a locked position right now. Pay attention here. We're going to press down on the yellow handle, and then over here there's a pin. It's rather inconspicuous, so it's okay. Just remember it's right underneath the motor. You're going to pull that pin out perpendicular to the saw, and now the hinge in the back with the spring mechanism will allow the saw to go to the up position. We're going to line up our cut. The entirety of the thickness of the blade is going to be on the waist side of the wood. So lower the blade down non-spinning to make sure that your blade is in the right spot on that piece of wood. You need to make sure that your wood is flat against the table and flat against the fence. If you put your wood up here and you turn that saw on and bring the blade down, it might look like you're more in the middle of the blade, right? The problem is the blade spins this direction, and it's going to throw that piece toward the back of the saw. Well, it's going to throw it toward the back of the saw with great force. It's going to scare you. Don't do that, and it's going to mess up your cut completely. The wood must be supported against the table and against the fence. That is absolute must. Get your support hand over here. Do not put your hand inside the yellow area like this. You're going to pull the trigger and hold it down throughout the entirety of the cut, but you need to stop the blade before you allow the saw to come back up, because it's on the hinge is under a spring. It's going to want to bring that blade up, right? You need to cut all the way through the wood, then release the trigger to let the blade stop. Once it has come to a complete stop, you can let the blade return to the upward position. Okay, blade has come to a complete stop, and I can allow it to return to the upward position. If you look at the pieces here, they are very close to the same length. It's hardly even measurable. You could take these pieces up to a disc sander and maybe flatten that out a little bit. I would not take off any points if you gave me 3 pieces that were this close to the same length. That is fine. That is perfectly within tolerance, okay? Now what I'm going to do is show you a couple different ways to mark these 3 pieces. But we can't do the exact same thing, or at least in the exact same way that we made this draft. We have to use slightly different techniques. And there's 3 different options. You could use the same ruler if you wanted to. You could use the speed square. This is probably the least precise method. You could use a combination square. This gets a little bit cumbersome, so I'm just going to show you all 3. There's a couple different ways to find your center. One way is to make an X. This is maybe the easiest way to find the center of something. It might not be the most precise way, but if you connect the opposite corners like that, and then turn your piece, connect the other corners, that should be right dead in the middle where those 2 lines intersect. So you're connecting opposite corners, you make what looks like an X, and that should be where they intersect. We're going to use our speed square or our combination square, and we're going to mark across like that. Make sure if you do this that your piece is flat up against the fence, otherwise the fence doesn't really do anything. We got fences on, squares, we got fences on saws, you got to use the fences. Now we're going to do the same thing, but in the long direction. Hold that thing up against the fence, and then put a line here. Now it doesn't need to go the full length of your piece. We're kind of making crosshairs, something for us to aim at. Because what we really want to do, guys, is we want to have a puzzle. This example puzzle from a student, these pieces are a little bit loose. We want the puzzle piece to fit together and for it to not really move around so much. So what I'm going to do then is take the actual piece, and you need to label this, by the way. At this point, when you've got 3 pieces, you need to put your name on there and decide that this is going to be, piece number 1. And once you put your name on the edge like this, and decide which piece is going to be 1, which piece is 2, and which piece is 3. You could write your period number on there too. These things tend to disappear, okay? I want you to take really good care of these. Make sure your name's on them, your period number's on them. You can keep them in your backpack if you want. You can keep them in the locker at your desk. Okay, now what we want to do is take this piece and we want to put it right here in the middle of that piece, and we're going to trace around where it's going to go. That way we know we have an exact match, a custom fit. You could use a ruler and find out the ideal measurements, just like we did over here, but in the real world, that might not perfectly match up. It probably won't. But if you have, because things might not be perfectly square, this wood might have an imperfection in it. When I cut it on the table saw for you, it may have been a little bit off this direction. Who knows? So you want to take your real world piece and put it up here to mark out what you want to cut. But you just need to make sure it's in the middle. So this is one method for finding the middle. We do this X, do this T, and then we aim with this piece. But how do we know where to aim? What we need to do is put some little marks right around here and then match those up with my T. So what we're going to do is take your square or ruler. Now we want to find the middle mark. It'll be right here, 3/4 of an inch. Flip it over, do it on the other side as well. The total width on this dimension is 1/2 inch. Let me show you how you could do it on a different tool. The width of this wood is 1/2 inch. There it is right there. So what's half of 1/2 inch? It's 1/4, which is 2/8 right there. What we're going to do is use those as a way to match up this piece with the markings on that piece. So now you've got those 4 marks like this. You got these crosshairs on this other piece, and you match them up just like that. Take your very sharp pencil, trace all the way around. So I'm going to hold this piece steady, pressing it down toward the table. Okay, now this is one method that some students have liked. There are other ways to do it as well. I'm going to show you another way to mark your main center notch. Here I'm going to be using piece number 2 and a combination square. So if you set your combination square to the width of your piece, which is 1.5 inches, then you just slide this down, and I'm just, on all 3 of these pieces, I'm going to start off by making that center notch, okay? So I'm going to put my center notch in the middle. It's got to be in the middle. So I got to mark out my vertical lines. So here we are, just like in the draft. This method is more like the draft, right? You can come over here to 1/2 inch, come over here to 1 inch, and put a couple marks. But those are like, basically they were like right up here, right? What I'm going to do now is do the same marks, but just down a little bit lower. So why don't I flip this piece around, Now it's upside down, if you will. Mark it over there at 1/2 inch and 1 inch. I could then connect those lines, and I'd have where these two vertical lines are on the draft. You could use a ruler and just kind of connect the dots. But what I'm going to do is something different, because I don't want to be too, like, this is kind of an ideal way of measuring it, but I still want to be able to put a piece up here, right, and trace around that. So I'm not actually going to trace these lines. I'm just going to use these lines as a way of honing in whereabouts I need to hold this before I trace around it. Kind of a two-step process. So I now need to move my combination square, make it a little bit bigger, all the way to the full length of this piece. The closer you are to the ideal numbers, the easier this process is going to be. This piece is very, very close to being exactly 4 inches, so that's great. I can go ahead and measure and mark where these two lines are supposed to be. And it says on the draft it's supposed to be 1 1/4 inches, so I'll come to 1 1/4 inches, put a very small mark there. And without moving anything around, I'll just back up from 4, 1 inch and 1/4 inch. So 4 minus 1 1/4, it's actually going to be right there, 2 3/4. All right, so you see, I'm just kind of marking where those corners should be. There's more measuring involved with this method, 1 1/4 inch and 2 3/4. But it does kind of let you use more the ideal measurements. It probably is more precise, because over here you might not quite hit those corners correctly when you're doing your original diagonal lines. So now what we're going to do is, again, take another piece of your puzzle and line it up with those marks that you just made, and then trace around it. I do feel like tracing your real life piece is the best way to get tight fittings for your puzzle. We're going to do piece number 3, and then we'll do the small notches. Another method is to use the speed square to make these marks at 1/2 inch and at 1 inch. And I just like to flip this thing around. That way you move less things. You just have to move the piece instead of move the ruler and your pencil and all that. And then you can hold this thing through the length at 1 1/4 inch. And because this piece is very close to 4 inches, I'll just do 2 3/4 right there, and then flip it around like this. So we're doing the other side, 1 1/4 inch, 2 3/4. Okay, so you've got an indication of where all 4 of your corners are. Keep your real life piece inside those measurements. And I tell you what, there's oftentimes going to be an optical illusion with the grain of the wood. So you think that it's straight based on your marks, but it might not look straight. The grain of the wood makes you think that maybe these lines aren't quite straight because the grain of the wood isn't parallel to the edge of the wood. Don't let that, trust your marks, trust your measurements. That's what I want to say. Okay, now we've got the 3 main center notches marked out, but as you can see, of course, piece 2 and piece 3 have these, what I'll call the sub notches, or the secondary smaller notches. Well, those are the things that we want to do last. Now, this is the secret to making this puzzle fit well. I'm going to tell you. When you cut it out, you want to cut out piece number 1 first, then skip to piece number 3, and then cut piece number 2. Because the sub notch in piece number 3 is going to help you mark the sub notch on piece number 2. So you want a custom fit between piece number 3 and piece number 2 for the puzzle to fit together nicely. Go ahead and cut piece number 1, but if somebody else is using the drill press right now and you can't cut that out, just put an X here, say, well, I'm going to drill my hole here in a minute, because you got to drill a hole first. You'll see why. This is the only piece, by the way, that you need to drill a hole on. Please only use the drill press for piece number 1. Okay? Now, what you can do while you're waiting for your turn on the drill press is go over to piece number 3 and take piece number 1, turn it sideways like this, and you're going to use piece number 1 to trace out that back notch here, that sub notch. Make sure that you measure out 1/8 inch, and make sure that you have centered piece number 1 this direction, inside this notch, okay? So as long as your piece is centered in the notch and it extends back a little bit. Now this says 1/8 inch, but it doesn't have to be all the way back there at 1/8 inch. It can be a little bit less. How can we find the center? I find the easiest way to do this is to use a ruler and set it up here and put a mark at 1/2 inch and a mark at 1 inch. You also need to measure back here about 1/8 inch, and I like to go just a little bit less than 1/8 inch just maybe on the inside of that 1/8 inch line. And you just put these marks here, and then you've got an indication of where that needs to go. Once you've got your piece inside all those little marks, I should be able to see the pencil marks. You can go ahead and trace around it. Now, I didn't actually do anything to make sure that this was perpendicular. I've just kind of eyeballed it to make sure it was perpendicular, but it's possible that it's a little bit off like this. So you might need to check yourself. One way to check yourself is to measure from the end. Well, that says that it is 1 3/4, and over here, 1 3/4. So I'm pretty close to being perpendicular, right? So this is gonna be piece number 3, but I cannot mark my sub notch on piece number 2 until after I cut piece number 3. So let's go ahead and start cutting piece number 1, piece number 3, and then I'll show you how to finish out with piece number 2.